Get started on time. So next up, we've heard a lot of discussion about API RP 1162. So we are happy to have Ms. Karen Simon join us. Thank you. Join us, and Karen will share with us more about the American Petroleum Institute's plans for our recommended practice. Karen Simon is the Senior Policy Advisor in the Midstream and Industry Operations Department of the American Petroleum Institute. She resides in Washington, D.C., and API is a national trade association representing over 650 companies involved in all aspects of oil and natural gas industry. Also, we had a representative from the API working group to participate on our public awareness program working group. It was not Karen, but we certainly had API's representation with the SWOT analysis work. And Karen is going to share with us a little bit about what's coming next since we've concluded the SWOT report and advancing our public awareness efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. I actually just adjusted this before, so is that good? I appreciate being here today. I've been with API for 12 years, and I actually know a few of you, several of you, I guess, in the crowd, but not a lot, even though I've been with API 12 years, because just last year I really started getting more involved in public awareness, which was my choice. I'm happy to be involved in it and learn something new from in our industry. But hold on. So for today's presentation, I was actually asked to talk about 3 different areas. The first one being what we at API have related to public awareness and the SWOT, and some of the SWOT findings, even though what we had was going on before the SWOT was being performed, it's relevant. And also the next steps for RP 1162, as well as how API will involve the stakeholders, including the public, when we get going on that effort, which I'll be talking about. I made several notes here based on the previous speakers because I was very interested to hear from Artie Buff regarding the Georgia Perry, the Pipeline Emergency Response Initiative. That was started back in March 2012, and I remember it clearly because we at API and also with the Association of Oil Pipelines, we were talking about forming an emergency response, an API AOPL emergency response team, which consisted of pipeline operators who were emergency response subject matter experts, SMEs. And we knew about the Georgia initiative that was talked about being started, and the thought was, well, do we wait for that to go on and see where PHMSA goes with it, or do we start with our own initiative, because we felt like it was very important to improve and enhance the communications and training for emergency responders across the United States. And so we ended up going forward with that and not waiting for PHMSA, but we had a representative who was on that Georgia Perry group who we'd keep up with and report so that we knew what they were doing and if there was anything we would want to do in addition. The related SWOT finding to the right there, from what Christy had said, I saw that as finding number 5 regarding emergency responders, and that's when we formed that emergency response team. It was back in 2012 we started looking at that. Some of the initiatives that they have come out with all had to do with communications, developing an ongoing dialogue and communications with emergency responders, training, enhanced training for emergency responders. I've got the website listed here where emergency responders can get online training for free. And that is actually, it was developed by the National Association of State Fire Marshals, and they maintain it as well. API and AOPL sponsor that site and pay for that. as of August 2014, when the site was first started, there have been over 4,000 emergency responders who have taken that training. It's just another avenue. Finding number 6 that Christy mentioned, which was the behavioral change, that we had actually our API public awareness group looked at, they looked at doing some strategic communications campaign, and that Craig Potts, who follows me, will talk about in much more detail. Some of the other things that were talked about by previous speakers, I know Robert Hill mentioned the local emergency planning committee and suggested pipeline operators put people on their local planning committees, emergency planning committees. And actually that is something that emergency response team had done as well in different areas. Another thing Rebecca mentioned, it's her proposal to have operators sponsor public awareness, the public to come to public awareness workshops and different meetings. That's not really that far out there, Rebecca, because actually for the emergency response team, the pipeline operators sponsored emergency responders to come to 3 different forums over the last 3 years and paid for their expenses, and different companies sponsored X number of emergency responders in their area to go to these an annual emergency response forum to share learnings between pipeline operators and emergency responders. So, and so the focus of the presentation, 1162, the current edition was published in 2010, and we normally would already have either started or finished the next revision, but we knew that the SWOT analysis was being performed, and we wanted to wait for that SWOT analysis. We wanted to wait for the final report. So API does have a standard setting process, and a standard every 5 years has to be looked at and either revised, reaffirmed, which means it stays as is for now for 5 more years, or X number of years, less than 5 years, or it's withdrawn. And so it was decided that it would be reaffirmed pending the final report, the SWOT analysis. And the next bullet says the revision is in progress. It's not really in progress per se. It's, we're talking about the next steps. So just a little bit of background that on our standards department, and its mission is to provide a forum for development of consensus-based industry standards. One of the things I wanted to mention is that an old standard, so the standards department was formed in 1923, and the very first standard that API came out with was one on drill threads. And it was because the different pipe fittings weren't fitting together because they were done by different manufacturers, and so it was determined that they really needed to have some standards in place. And one of the, if props are good, so one of the analogies I have are cell phone chargers and computer chargers, which, they don't fit everybody's cell phone or computer, and that's something that we now have with the standards for oil and gas industry. And so to date, we have approximately 650 standards and over a lot of volunteers, 7,000 active volunteers in 50 different countries. And 1/3 of all API standards are referenced in US regulations. And this is important because in 1995, federal agencies are required by law, whenever possible, to use voluntary consensus standards. That was something I didn't know before this presentation, so learning something myself. And API is accredited as a standards developer by ANSI, which is the American National Standards Institute, and every 5 years we get audited. That's part of the standards process. We just finished an audit in December 2015. The report came out. And just recently, just 2 weeks ago, we were reaccredited as a standards developer. Just briefly, I mentioned standards. Our standards department, 1162, is a recommended practice. Standard is used as a broad term to cover what we call specifications, which are documents that are very technical, equipment type specifications. Recommended practices, which are documents that are more best practices that industry uses, such as the public awareness document, and different documents like that. And standards are documents that actually combine the two, specifications and recommended practices. So with due process, the due process that we have using our ANSI developed standard, our program, the key thing is that the standards and recommended practices are established when substantial agreement is reached, which generally means 2/3 majority. The goal is to get a result everyone can live with. And the other thing is that whoever submits a comment, that comment must be addressed in some way. It may be accepted, it may be the task group that looks at it, that developed the standard or that did the revision may decide, well, we've addressed this elsewhere, or whether or not, they have to have some reason for if they don't accept it. But the goal is to get as many people as possible to agree. For our standards, the task group, the different ones that revise and update and develop standards, it is open to all parties that have a direct and material interest. In the case of our pipeline standards, that might be a member of the public who is a homeowner next to a pipeline. It could be regulator, it could be Pipeline Safety Trust, it could be any of the two people, or the CSERT. I'm sorry, not CERT, but it's CERT, the group that you're with there that I learned about today. And material could be an operator, a manufacturer. But the other key takeaway here is that we strive for balance in who's on the task group, and there's different ways to get there. I think in the past, the balance was achieved by, it started with perhaps mostly pipeline operators, and then asked for comments from the various public, but going forward, and we have gone this way in the last several standards, is we want to be more inclusive right up front. And then this next slide just shows the various methods of outreach that we'd have to let the different stakeholders, including the public, know that that we are looking for members to participate on the task group. And I also want to say that there's a few different ways you can participate. You can participate by being on the actual task group that revises and updates it, or you could be a member of a reading group who gets the drafts, so that and you may decide to do that for whatever reason, time constraints or whatever. But you want to be involved in the process. You want to see what's being written and comment on it. Your comments would go to the task group. This is long before the actual official balloting process occurs. And I think a question, a discussion was about being on the voting group. There is a process to be on the voting group, and that is something, I have a slide with my name and then the name of our standards person, and he should be contacted, John Buflid, if you're interested in being on that voting group. There are specific obligations for being on the voting group, but it's definitely something that if you or anyone you know is interested in doing, that you should contact our standards group. So I've included the website here for the balloting. Of course, that's very far down the line, but that's the official ballot. Anyone can actually comment on it. You don't have to be on the task group. This is something that you get. It's one vote for company, so per company or per entity. So whether or not you work for a company of 20,000 people, that company gets one vote regarding the commenting on the document. Or if you're a member of the public, you get an equal vote. So, and then I mentioned about the you could be on the reading list or you can be on the task group itself. So the next steps for the revision are that, and this may seem contradictory, but again, it's because we have a process at API, we have to get the revision going, we have to actually submit a proposal to to our pipeline operations and technical group, which is our pipeline. Basically, they're the management committee that oversees all our pipeline standards. So even though the pipeline standards must be, like all standards, must be looked at within 5 years, excuse me, it could be that it's determined that in 2 years, a document may need to be updated. We've done that with our SCADA standard, actually, our security standard. So what we're looking to do in 2016, now that the SWOT analysis report is out, we're going to form an ad hoc team, and which is going to consist of it'll be volunteers from the public awareness group members who are interested in reviewing the current 1162 but looking at the SWOT analysis to see where it's appropriate to add and change different areas to enhance 1162, also from the experience of the last 6 years to see what needs to be changed. And at that point, that group will take the recommendations to the full public awareness group to say, okay, this is what we think we need to do, and whether or not we need to request money. But then a proposal, the proposal is actually fairly simple. It's just it's a form that we have at API for all our standards and recommended practices, and it'll say who's going to be the lead on it, and if any money is requested, and approximate length of time it'll take to do this. And so that will go to the operations and technical group. They'll approve, yes, we agree this needs to be, and whether or not any funding is included or if more is needed. And then that ad hoc group will be disbanded. And at that point, which we anticipate will be in 2017, is when we'll be gathering and starting today. I mean, with this workshop, we'll be gathering names and contact information of people who would like to be on the task group, the reading group, or like I said, if you're interested in being on that voting committee, then you should contact the standards person, who is listed here as John Buford. So I have the next few slides, and I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to buzz through them. But basically, it's I just included them to show that for the government-cited regulations, they are available for free to view online on our website. And the website link is there. It'll take you through, and you click on the IBR reading room and visit the IBR portal. And then from that point, it asks you to sign on with your email address. We don't send you emails, but it's just a measure of tracking, how many people are looking at the standards and what they're doing, if they're, which standards they're most interested in, that type of thing. So that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Karen. Next up is Mr. Craig Potts. He will be joining us to talk about measuring behavior for excavators. Craig Potts is the Public Awareness Coordinator for Marathon Pipeline. In his position, he's responsible for communicating pipeline safety messages to various external stakeholders. So let's welcome Craig.
Thank you, Christy. Hang in there because we're getting close to 5. So, yes. Okay, so it's changing the behavior of excavators. We've heard a fair amount today about behavior change, so this will kind of go right along with that. So let's take a look at the SWOT, and behavior change was mentioned 8 times. When I went through it, a quick review, I found 8 different mentions. And I just pulled out a few here to give you some idea of what was included in there. So lack of common understanding, challenge to measure it, need some more guidance on measuring, how to measure it, and if behavior change should be a goal of public awareness or not, and if so, then how do we measure that? So let's take a look at the current recommended practice 1162 when it talks about measuring program effectiveness. That's 8.4, that section of the recommended practice. Measure 3, desired behaviors by intended stakeholder audiences. And then below that, they're talking about appropriate prevention behaviors. So when we're looking at excavators, which I'm going to look at just one specific audience group today, excavators, probably the most common thing we would ask then is, are they contacting the one call center prior to excavating? So let's look at some data to see if that's actually occurring. So let's start with the CGA 2014 DIRT report. And for those that are not familiar with CGA's DIRT report, this is an annual report that comes out. They collect, companies can submit data on all their damages, and they detail who's causing the damage, what type of damage it was, what kind of utility. There's a lot of data in their report. So I'm pulling out some highlights here that I just wanted to share with the group. So in 2014, nearly 49,000 more damages events than in 13. Excavators account for more than 70% of the damage events. And if you look at that chart over on the right-hand side, the gray bars at the bottom, those are incidents by or damages by excavators. As you go up, there's different entities, but you can just see graphically that it is excavators causing the bulk of the damage. Third bullet, notification not made, meaning not contacting the one call center prior to digging, was the root cause in 25% of those damages. And CGA on their report refers to damage events. That's what they call a damage to underground facility. And then in quotes, that last bullet, this is right out of the DIRT report, contacting 811 remains the single most effective means of reducing damage. So here's another bit of data, which we like to look at data and have some metrics to make some decisions. This comes from Customer Care, which is a research company that has a contract with API. That they do a survey every other year on odd years where they measure all 4 of the major stakeholder groups for public awareness. And this is for excavators. So what they were gauging here on these questions are, what's the percentage of excavators who know they're supposed to call before they're digging or make contact with the one call center, whether that's a phone call or if that's submitting an online ticket, and compare that to the percentage who always do that. And you see that we've got about a 14% gap between those who know to do it and those who are actually doing it. So let's go back to the SWOT now. And there was a section there that talked about, and I think Christy kind of emphasized this earlier this morning, about opportunities. Let's focus on the opportunities. So when you look at the excavator section, there's some bullets that kind of jumped out at me when I looked at this category. So let's just run through a few of these. Reword damage prevention messages to put more emphasis on the benefits of calling 811. Continually evaluate comprehensive opportunities for outreach. Look for opportunities for a nationwide campaign on public awareness. We've heard that from some others. Adopt a more data-driven, strategic approach to excavator outreach. And then emphasize to excavators that damage prevention is about their safety and their bottom line. So now let's talk about what's already happened in the industry to address this. So back in 2013, the API Public Awareness Group made a decision that we should set a goal to develop a 5-year strategic communication campaign to change the behavior of excavators. Because we've seen this data for some years, and we felt like, are we to the point as an industry, and not only the pipeline industry, but the larger damage prevention industry, Are we to the point where we've done a lot of awareness of 811, a lot of awareness of calling before digging, but are we ready to start behavior change to tackle that? Because that's going to be a much tougher task to do. It's going to cost more money, it's going to take more time and more effort. So we went through a RFP process, and we selected Fleshman Hillard as a public relation firm to help us on this path to do this. Most of the people that do public awareness in companies, they'll have backgrounds in communication, they might be compliance people, they might work in government affairs, they might work in public affairs, they might work in the integrity department of their companies. So we're not all communications experts. And so I want you to be aware of that, which is why we felt like it was important to have some experts guide us, some subject matter experts guide us in this behavior change process. So then in 2015, we raised $270,000, mostly from pipeline operators and some others and some associations, to do some stakeholder research, to get a little smarter about excavators and the best way to approach them, and then also to develop a preliminary campaign plan. So let's look at the findings first from what occurred here. So there was an online survey as well as phone interviews. And Fleshman Hillard divided the group into two categories. One, excavator owners, and second is excavator laborers. And they felt like that was important because there's two separate jobs. We don't just want to say excavators, which is what we typically do, but they're separate, and they felt like they needed to be treated separately. So what they found with the excavator owners was that only 41% always call before digging, and their primary concerns are the safety of their crews and liability on the work that they do. They rely heavily on their industry peers and groups. So they talk to one another and learn from each other. Excavator laborers, very low awareness of 811. Majority view their jobs as dangerous. They respond favorably to messages about safe digging, and they found it refreshing to hear those, so they don't often get those. So this is a slide from Fleshman Hillard, and I'm going to spend just a little bit of time here explaining this. So we gave them, Fleshman Hillard, we gave them brochures that we mail out to excavators, and the several companies provided those for them. We gave them focus group data that we had with excavators. We gave them the survey data. I showed you that one slide on the survey data that we do every other year. We gave them that data. So we gave them a lot of data, a lot of materials that we send out, and we said, look at all this, and then evaluate it, and tell us what's the best way to change behavior. And they came back to us and said, here's where you're at. You're talking to the rational side of the brain. All your materials tend to be fact-based, it's one-way communication, and it's a single channel. You're mailing your materials. That's the only way you're primarily communicating with excavators. And they said, if you want to change behavior, you have to talk to the emotional side of the brain. That's where behavior change happens. And so you need to change your messaging from just being fact-based and speaking, saying this is the law, it's state law, you got to call before you dig, because you've had some progress. We can see by looking at your papers data, all the surveys you do, that you're having some progress increasing awareness of pipelines and awareness of 811. So we can see that, but you're not changing behavior. And to change behavior, you have to make an emotional connection with your audience group. And quite frankly, we're not doing that yet. We're not there. So then they gave us a couple different campaign themes to think about, and the larger group decided, let's go with this head-to-heart thought. And if you just think back of the last slide where I talked about, we're talking to the rational side of the brain, that's the head, we need to get to the heart. So we need to combine the two. So their research showed that excavators value their family above everything else, which is what we want to tap into. So we need a campaign that's designed around excavators to make this emotional connection about how they do their job and the reasons that they're working. And then we'll have some creative concepts that will liken a call to 811 or submitting an online ticket to other safety measures they take, like using seat belts, making sure their kids have a helmet on when they're riding the bikes, those sorts of things that are just natural safety things that you would not, if you're a parent, you're going to not let that kid get on the bike without a safety helmet on. So it's the same kind of thing. So part of that is going to be that your family's relying on you, your job's important, it's dangerous, your family's relying on you, You're providing that paycheck, that income, but to build that family tie that we want you to go home safe, and the best way to do that is to work safely. So here's some other things that, and this might be a little tough to read because it's kind of small, but part of the, and again, this is a preliminary campaign plan. So there's some content development, so they would develop some videos, real-life videos about excavators, some about who have done the wrong thing, maybe not called and had some incidents, and some who are doing the right thing. So we want both sides of the coin, if you will, positive and negative. I'm even having trouble with these old eyes. I'm even having a little trouble reading. And then package some of this information so individual operators can use it as well. It's not just for the campaign. Then they have some speaking events that they would line up to go to different excavator shows and do those, and then some briefings. So there's a variety of things that they're going to do here, and then there's the earned or the free media, so placement in landscape publications and some other excavator trade publications, as well as some outreach in community newspapers and radio. And then they would measure everything to see if we're effective, if we're actually moving the bar on behavior change. So this is why they say it works, this sort of approach. If you add this emotional content to information they're already familiar with, it's not like they haven't heard the call before you dig message, but you put it in a new format, if you will, or they see it anew. So emotional campaigns consistently produce considerably more powerful long-term effects than rational, persuasive campaigns. They are twice as efficient as rational campaigns, provide a means to participate, recognize, and be recognized by your peers. So part of this is building like a community, if you will. And one of the things Fleshman Hiller told us is that peer pressure exists. If you see your peers all doing the right thing, they're posting things on social media, they're sharing it at excavator shows, that they're doing all the right thing, it puts pressure on the excavator who isn't doing the right thing to change his behavior. And it's consistent with what they value, their work and why they do it. And again, you've got this emotional tie to the family. And it's a durable platform, so family values are enduring, the stories are evergreen, so they're going to be around for a while. Okay, so this is kind of my last slide here, and it's called Roadmap, but I want to kind of lay out what's happened from when we started this in 2013 and this last year. So this was shared with API Pipeline Leadership, so this was started as an API initiative, Pipeline Leadership last November, and after Fleshman Hiller looked at everything, all of our materials, all of our data, everything, they came back and they said, after a strategy session, they came back and said, it needs to be simple, the message needs to be simple, and it needs to be focused probably on one thing, and that is 811. And so when we shared that with our pipeline leadership, they said, well, if that's the message, if it doesn't have to be pipeline specific, if it's supposed to be do the right thing as an excavator and either make the call or submit an online ticket, then maybe API should not be the one leading the effort. Maybe it should be a Common Ground Alliance effort, initiative. And so then we took it to I actually took it to the Common Ground Alliance Education Committee in June last month, presented it there. They formed a new task team for this initiative. I'll go back in September with an update. I've already gone back to Fleshman Hillard and asked them to update their proposal, which is about a year old now, to see if it needs to just be refreshed, if anything's changed. So they'll be on the phone to answer some questions of the group, which I was not able to answer last month. And then assuming that's approved and we actually have members on the task team, because at this point we don't have any members, or I think we've got one member, we'll go ahead and then seek CGA board approval to move forward in November. So all that, there's still some hoops to jump through. We're estimating, or what Fleshman Hiller had provided us as a budget is $250,000 to $300,000 a year for this campaign to try and change behavior. And again, remember, it's going to be a 5-year campaign. So I would think we're really going to get started next year, and then probably a full-blown campaign if this goes forward by 2018. So with that, I'll turn it back to Christy.
I'll have to remind myself I have a couple of questions about that when we get to the Q&A portion. All right, well, next up we have Ms. Yvonne Lowe, who will be joining us to share a unique perspective Yvonne is the Manager of Customer Engagement and Corporate Communications at Southwest Gas Corporation. In this capacity, she's responsible for the company's marketing and corporate communications. Ms. Lowe is also a member of the American Gas Association, and she will be joining us with some specific perspectives from that organization's viewpoint.
Hello, everyone. I'm Yvonne Lowe from Southwest Gas. And my slides have disappeared. All right, before I start, I'd like to thank PHMSA for inviting us to comment and to provide our perspectives on the SWOT report and improving public awareness. And in my presentation today, I'll be discussing some of AGA's top takeaways from the SWOT report and provide some examples on how natural gas operators creatively work around some of our challenges and provide our recommendations for improving public awareness. All right. The American Gas Association, or the AGA, represents natural gas operators across the nation. And the natural gas pipeline infrastructure includes 20,000 miles of gathering facilities, about 300,000 miles of transmission pipelines, and 2.2 million miles of distribution pipes. Southwest Gas is a member of the American Gas Association. We operate across 3 states in Nevada, California, and Arizona, and we serve about 1.9 million customers. We own transmission and distribution facilities, and we also operate an interstate transmission pipeline called Paiute Pipeline, which is our subsidiary. And we're a member of the Distribution Public Awareness Council and a member of the AGA. The American Gas Association is committed to supporting public awareness and pipeline safety through efforts to educate and engage stakeholders. The AGA supports damage prevention and pipeline safety programs, and it utilizes training facilities and finds opportunities to expand outreach to stakeholders. The AGA is committed to working closely with emergency responders and collaborate with stakeholders near transmission lines to increase awareness for PIPA recommended best practices. There are several top takeaways from the SWOT analysis which resonated with natural gas pipeline operators. And in the next few slides, I will describe various topics that we feel strongly about and give examples for how member companies have advanced in these areas. So looking at strengths, one of the areas which resonated with pipeline operators is industry collaboration. It is extremely valuable. As an industry, we have gathered to compare data, conduct benchmarking exercises. I know there was a lady over there that asked about that. And we looked at trends over time. In fact, the Distribution Public Awareness Council at this point is conducting a benchmarking exercise so that we can compare apples to apples. Members then are better able to identify where their strengths and weaknesses are in comparison to fellow utilities, and then identify collectively a roadmap where we can advance public awareness. Secondly, strong collaboration with emergency responders. There you go. Secondly, we support very strong collaboration with emergency responders. An example that I would like to share with you is a video which Southwest Gas collectively developed with the fire departments within the Nevada area. So they had come to us and we were sitting around the table talking about what their needs are in their training. And we worked with them on content. We were able to provide some emergency response safety messages within that video. I will not be showing you the entire video because it's 30 minutes long, but I thought it would be, can you press play? But I thought it would be good to emphasize the point that this, because it was collaboratively developed, we had a lot of buy-in from the fire chiefs, and the minute it was ready, it was so enthusiastically received that they have included this in their training curriculum for all their firefighters. Moving on. In the area of strengths, we cannot agree more that member utilities are communicating pipeline safety awareness messages in a frequent manner and often exceeding requirements. Taking Southwest Gas as an example, this is just a quick snapshot of what is happening within a year in our public awareness outreach campaign. We have hundreds of ads running year-round, thousands of radio spots. We send millions of printed copies, printed pieces, different types of brochures to different target audiences. We engage the public on the internet and mobile fronts. We work on a year-round basis, and we participate in numerous face-to-face events and community outreach efforts to further public awareness messages. However, it's important to note that there is a delicate balance between creating highly effective public awareness outreach program and, as a regulated utility, being good stewards of ratepayer resources. This is something that is particularly difficult to maintain for smaller operators with a smaller rate base, such as municipalities, where the challenge of delicate balance is even more pronounced. So let's talk a little about the weaknesses that had resonated with us, and interestingly, the weaknesses are somewhat related. As a communicator, we feel that there are too many messages that has to be communicated and could potentially create stakeholder overload. And at this point, let's pause for a moment and look at how we address this challenge. Within the RP, it requires an ad within the newspaper once a year. And when you look at how much information is to be shared with different stakeholder publics, stakeholder audiences, it is highly unlikely that the one advertisement is going to be effective. So what we did at Southwest Gas is actually to separate those ads into 3 ads instead. One focused on the 811, call before you dig, a damage prevention type of message. The second one is a leak recognition and response type of message. And the third one is general information about pipeline maintenance, pipeline safety, etc. And we found that this has worked for us very well, and we run these ads throughout the year. So back to related weaknesses. Difficulty in measuring behavior in part can be attributed to the first and the second point of too many messages and stakeholder overload, which leads to a need for a clearer and common understanding of this behavior change, and also what their related KPIs are, or key performance indicators. for this behavior change. So moving along quickly, we've come to the favorite part of my presentation, which is opportunities. So there are two key areas that we think are opportunity areas, and what I would like to share with you are just some examples of how we create compelling messages so that we can generate interest and grab attention. And we know that for the public, there may be some very concerned public that wants a lot of information about gas, and there are some who will not think about natural gas unless something affects them. So to create compelling messages is a very interesting task, because you have to, it can only be done when the right messages are served to the right, at the right time, using the right communication channel to the right audience before it sticks. And then add to that, you got to add some creativity and some innovation to it, and that's a very difficult thing to accomplish. So as a communicator that's familiar with engaging with different audiences, we know that there are some communications best practices that would come with messaging and retainability and frequency, et cetera, that we try to include within our program. In the next few slides, I will scroll through them rather quickly, but I'll show you some interesting examples and creative tactics that we have used to reach different target audiences. In this next slide here, what I'm going to show you is a video that Southwest Gas has developed to reach a segment of the public who is 25 years old and younger. In a recent effectiveness survey, we learned that this segment is the least aware of recognizing gas leaks and what to do if they identify a gas leak. So we know that reaching this group requires us to communicate leak recognition and response messages, which could be pretty heavy in its content, but we are trying to communicate to them in their lingo, in a media that they're familiar with, and for us to even get a chance at grabbing their attention. So what we did was we worked with a group of honor students from the Arizona State University, so they're within the demographic group that we're trying to reach, and we asked them, okay, look, we need to tell you these things. How would you like us to tell you, and in what way? So the project was for them to develop a script for us, and with that script, we developed a video which we ran on Pandora and through our social media feeds. And it was extremely successful. Over a weekend, we scored about 5,000 views on YouTube, and the number continues to grow. So I will try to play that video. It doesn't play. Can you click that video, please?
You're out for a jog, getting in the zone when...
Ew! Oh, it smells like rotten eggs.
Meanwhile, dirt is swirling in the air, and you hear a hissing noise.
Dude, it's a snake!
No, dude. A hissing sound, swirling dirt, or rotten egg odor can mean there's a natural gas leak. Natural gas lines can be buried anywhere. If you suspect a leak, leave immediately and call 911 and Southwest Gas.
Thanks, deep-voiced narrator.
You're welcome, young person. Brought to you by Southwest Gas.
So yeah, the kids told us what they want to see, some humor in our approach. So on that same vein, we thought that some of the best practices here is using the extraordinary to grab attention. Nobody is going to miss that huge nose hanging over a major intersection. And Xcel Energy has done that, and it has been extremely successful for them. And if you're an excavator, you know your excavation equipment. And excavators are not going to miss that one-of-a-kind truck hoe, which Southwest Gas has 2 of, and I believe those are the only 2 in the nation. So we had 811 messages all over that, and when the truck goes around the city to different parts in response to emergency requirements, the messages are out there. The next thing, which is some food for thought, is to use a familiar item like a food truck and put a creative spin on it. This is demonstrated through Vectron's public awareness swag truck. So they would, I believe they would drive it up to job sites and they would give excavation swag. And the next thing that we thought was an interesting approach is to reach the public by placing messages in areas where there is an immediate connection to what they're doing. Southwest Gas had tree tags that are on plants within nurseries. We worked with the Home Depot and Lowe's to have those tree tags added there too. So when somebody comes in to buy something to plant, they're going to see that tree tag, and the tree tag tells them to call 811 before they dig. And also seed packets that can be planted, which is that green spade, the green little shovel you see up there. Then the most important thing in reaching our stakeholders is we have to be there where they live, work, and play. So finding unique and creative opportunities on social media, Google, videos, mobile apps, we get into their phones, we get into their everyday lives by being in sporting arenas, etc., and community events. Those are little opportunities that we can leverage. Next, there is a tremendous opportunity in sharing best practices, lessons learned, and collective brainstorming. And this is where the American Gas Association plays a critical role. The AGA conducts peer reviews, which covers public awareness as a topic. In this program, members voluntarily participate in the program where other members review their public awareness programs and provide critique and identify areas to improve. And additionally, the AGA also provides a platform where members can discuss public awareness from a strategy perspective, taking into consideration related efforts in a holistic way, efforts such as public safety management system, operator damage prevention, safety alert notification system, and the incident command system. The Distribution Public Awareness Council is a consortium of companies that have gotten together to focus specifically on public awareness, administration, and implementation. And they're looking closely at developing some standards and sharing best practices where we can work together to have some consensus standards. Now moving quickly to the threads that resonated with the American Gas Association's members were that stakeholders can be unreceptive for those who are uninformed or involved in other aspects of their lives, unless it impacts them directly. So our messages, to Craig's point about head to heart, we have to make it matter to them. Operators are required to take action, but stakeholders are not required to listen. Measuring behavior change is very challenging, and innovation and creativity may be stifled by a compliance-focused program. So the following slides will summarize our recommendations for mitigating threats and improving public awareness. To summarize what we've covered. To summarize what we've covered, program requirements need to provide a level of flexibility to suit different operators' needs and encourage creativity. At Southwest Gas, we operate both a distribution system and an interstate transmission pipeline. And our interstate transmission facilities are located in remote, often rural areas where there are very few people around it, but covers a large territory. And our distribution pipelines, by comparison, are clustered in highly populated areas where many people live and work. It's evident that program requirements need to consider both ends of the spectrum and how we can effectively communicate messages given the nature of the geographical hurdles. Next, messaging is key. Required messaging needs to be streamlined, focused, effective, and sticky, meaning that it needs to be easily retained. And yearly, as an example, Southwest Gas, we conduct message effectiveness and stickiness survey. In studies, we actually have people come in and review certain messages, and we're in the process of doing that this year again, looking at the stickiness of messages and see how we can craft messages that will resonate with the different target audiences. We recommend efforts to provide consistent industry messages, and I'm very glad to hear that we're down that path already. And collaboration, it's very important. It's a very important element in improving public awareness. We collaborate within the industry to benchmark, measure, and improve. We also need to establish collaborative relationships with stakeholder groups, both on the national and local level, to further public awareness. Where possible, we recommend efforts to leverage legislation or regulation, whether it's existing or new, to demand stakeholder attention, possibly with emergency responders, public officials, and excavators. And finally, continuous improvement. Know the requirements, use creative tactics, measure, 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 innovate, and repeat the whole process. So with that, I've come to the end of my presentation. We want to state that AGA and its members are dedicated to enhancing pipeline safety and strongly support the industry's effort to advance the cause. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, giving us some of your AGA and some of your organization, your particular company's best practices and different ideas. There's a lot of creative ideas regarding public awareness and how to reach out to different groups. And up next, we have Kesley Tweed, who will come share some additional ones. Kesley is the manager of strategic partnerships and public awareness for Enbridge. She served also on our public awareness working group, and she is representing INGA, the Interstate Natural Gas Association of America also. So I will turn it over to her to share remarks.
Thanks, Christy. And thanks to everyone for hanging in there. Oopsie. I know it's getting late in the day, and there's lots of fun things to do here in Chicago. So just appreciate your attention, and hopefully everyone's still awake out there. So I'm here today representing INGA, or the Interstate Natural Gas Association of America. That one's a tongue twister. So I was involved in their public awareness working group for about 2 years in 2014 and 2015. Since then, I've rolled off the committee. I co-chaired during those couple of years, and I had the opportunity to represent INGA on the PHMSA working group and provide input into the SWOT analysis. It was a great experience, a really good process to get the group around the table and really be able to start talking about things, again, going to the theme of beyond compliance. So a couple of key phrases I've really picked up on today: collaboration, innovation. Those are things that we talked a lot about in that group, and I think are going to be key themes going forward. So after reviewing the SWOT report, there were 4 specific topics, themes, if you will, that jumped out at the INGA Public Awareness Group. And these are things that really, even over the last few years since the last public awareness workshop that was held by PHMSA, this group and the public awareness group at INGA has been very dedicated to working on. So stakeholder input on public awareness. We've heard a lot today about going directly to your audience to get their feedback and hearing specifically what they have to say and using that to improve our public awareness efforts. There is one specific example I'm going to share with you that demonstrates a way that INGA has done that. But I think it goes beyond even just the direct stakeholders. It's also, working together as an industry and coming up with those best practices and common ways that we can work together and using that input, again, to strive for continuous improvement. Which brings me to the next point, collaborative programs. We've heard a lot today about, bombarding people with information and lots of different key messages that we need to communicate. So I think the more we can bind together as an industry and even beyond the industry, working hand in hand with our stakeholders once again to get some of these national campaigns off the ground, I think the more successful that we will be. And again, there's a couple of specific examples that I'll share with you. Embracing 811. So INGA, as well as many of you in the room, were big supporters of 811, a big social media campaign that INGA has been developing over the past few months. 811 is a big component of that. They're very involved in 811 Day, and 811 has a big presence on the website, so it is one of those things that INGA is definitely behind. And then emergency responder communications. INGA has been dedicated for many years to advancing the relationship and the response capabilities of emergency responders. And again, there's one specific project that has been a collaborative in the industry that we'll highlight today. So that project is actually called the Shoulder to Shoulder video series. So this is something that was put out earlier this year that is a series of several videos for emergency responders. It was developed as a collaborative initiative among INGA, so it started with the Public Awareness Working Group within INGA, and we went to API and AOPL and got all three trade associations to be involved in the effort. So when you talk about a national campaign, it's pretty close to national level when you have three of the major trade associations in the U.S. involved in it. So what we did was we held a few teleconferences. We went directly to emergency response associations. So IFC, NASFM, NENA, those are just a couple of examples. We also invited individual emergency responders to provide input. So for example, Dirk Dunham from Calhoun County, who was very involved in the Marshall, Michigan incident, was a member of Unified Command. He was part of these discussions to provide input, so going directly to someone who has been, to your point, impacted by an incident. So through these conference calls, we vetted ideas for the topics that we were going to address. We actually let them preview some of the videos and provide their input, and we used that to improve them. What I will say is that just from going in with a good idea of what they wanted to see and having listened to stakeholders even before we started to develop the project, once we showed them the actual products, there weren't a lot of major changes. So a lot of what we were able to gather up front really helped us to develop a campaign and a series of videos that seemed to really resonate well with the emergency responders. Since that time, this has been shown, or the videos have been shown through an emergency response advisory board that has been set up by API, and we've had really great feedback from the trade associations that are part of that group, and really good feedback from the emergency responders who have seen the videos so far just since they were rolled out earlier this year. So what the campaign actually consists of is a 30-second sort of commercial or promo spot, if you will, which I'll show you in just a couple of seconds. But then there are 6 a little bit longer videos, and by longer, I'm talking 3 to 5 minutes. Our goal with this campaign, we know that the way that we consume media as a society is changing, and so we want to plan to that and plan to those expectations and needs of our target audience as well as the public. So we wanted to make them short, to the point. Again, we interview emergency responders directly so that it's not just pipeline operators. We, of course, do have pipeline operators represented in the videos, but there's a lot more quotes and interviews with emergency responders of all different types. The theme for the video series is shoulder to shoulder, and so we felt it was important to communicate that we're all in this together. It's not just pipeline operators that would be involved in the event of an incident in a community, or emergency responders. Everybody's going to be working side by side, shoulder to shoulder, and it's not just the firefighter, it's also law enforcement, it's EMS, it's the 911 dispatch center. So we've got all of those perspectives represented in the video series. So the 6 topics we cover, we give a brief overview of pipelines and why we have them, where you can find them, all that sorts of basic information. That's an important introduction into pipelines. And then we have 2 specific videos, one on gas pipelines and one on oil pipelines, because from a response perspective, as we all know, the response is very different. So we wanted to break those out and provide some specific information on the various types of products and how an emergency responder can safely respond. Roles in pipeline response. I think this one for me is the most important, and I think a really good example again of how everyone would be working together and what their specific role is in an incident. So we go all the way from the 911 dispatcher receiving the call to how the pipeline operator would be responding, firefighter and their role, law enforcement and they control the scene, EMS, all the way down the line into the emergency manager role. And again, we cover that in about 5 minutes, so it's a pretty quick overview. But something that we are looking at going forward is, can we further develop some of these topics and go a little bit more into detail on, what some of the roles might be or some of the specific concerns that responders might have as they're responding to incidents. Preparation and resources. So this video talks a lot about how there are opportunities for responders to prepare themselves in advance and to be more educated on the pipelines in their community. So we talk about things like emergency response exercises, the National Pipeline Mapping System, the emergency response portal that API has available, and lots of other different resources. And then the final video is on incident management best practices. So we talk about what you might need to know or what some of the best practices are if you do have to respond to an incident. So things like incident action plans and the incident command system are 2 of the key things that we cover in that video. So we do have a YouTube channel set up, and the website address is shoulder2shoulder.tv, and that's where you can find all of the videos. And we really invite, the audience today and others to share this. For this to really get out there, we need help in getting it out to the emergency responders in your communities. And if you're a pipeline operator, feel free to share this. We do have a toolkit available with some promotional resources. We have a brochure available to help promote this, but we want to make it easy to get to, and so that's why it's available on YouTube. So what I'm going to show you today is just a quick 30-second clip, and this is what we're calling our promo spot. And it's really just developed to get emergency responders interested in getting more information and going to the website to watch the rest of the videos. So we'll play that for you now.
While pipeline incidents are rare, they can happen.
We all need to be ready and prepared for pipeline emergencies.
By working together, shoulder to shoulder,
we can protect ourselves and our communities.
We are all in this together.
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 So one thing you'll notice about that video is it does push the envelope a little bit as far as what sorts of images that we're showing. So when you're speaking to emergency responders, seeing flames and emergency situations is something that they're used to dealing with. It's what they deal with every day, and so that's something that resonates with them. With some of our other audiences, we've had some feedback that might be a little bit scary to show something like that. But with emergency responders, it's very much, what they deal with, and that's what's going to capture their attention. So that's what we wanted to use. And a big thank you to the Training Center for Emergency Responders at Texas A&M. They actually built us a prop in order to be able to simulate a natural gas fire. And, we're really critical in getting the emergency response audience kind of rallied behind this video and getting a lot of the interviews set up and some of those firsthand experiences, and also provided a lot of experts. So, they've got a great training program. They bring in emergency responders from all over the world and train them on hazardous material response and even pipeline response. And so we were able to interview some of their in-house experts on what sort of advice they had for emergency responders. So we've had some great results from this campaign. So as I mentioned, we launched this earlier this year, so in about January of this year. We've had 10,500 views on the YouTube page, 29 embeds from external sources. So we've had lots of operators who've put this in e-campaigns, put it on their website, promoted through social media. That's something we hope to grow and continue as time goes on, but very successful so far. 28 subscribers to the YouTube page and a 3% click-through rate on a Google AdWords campaign. So what we did was we actually sponsored advertising of keywords. So words or phrases like emergency plus response, emergency plus planning, police plus training. So you can see the list up here. So basically when someone searches for these words or this combination, they're provided with an ad that would then take them to the YouTube page to promote this. So when we developed the campaign, what we knew going in was that you're not always going to get people going to the website or emergency responders seeking out this type of information. It's one of many things that they train on and one of many different things they need to respond to in their community. So we wanted to be able to push this out to them in some new and innovative ways. And so that's something that we're looking at expanding as well, is using some Google AdWords and using some other type of media and social media to continue to get the word out. We also looked at the top 5 states. So we've had a good response from Texas, California, Virginia, Ohio, and Oklahoma. And as I mentioned, this is an ongoing effort. So, we've had good results, but it's not something that's going to stop. We want to make sure that we can continue to promote this and get this into the hands of emergency responders. So again, I encourage you, please share the website, and particularly with the emergency response audience, and we're happy to provide promotional resources if that's something that's of value to you. The second campaign that I wanted to share with you today that INGA has developed that we felt was very relevant to some of the discussions that were going on here today, as well as in the SWOT report. It does expand beyond public awareness. This is more of a broad sort of pipeline awareness type campaign. But very relevant when you think of new and innovative ways of communicating. And also one of the key messages of the public awareness program and in the regulation is pipeline purpose and reliability, and that's what this campaign is really all about. So the campaign is called America's Energy Link, and it is a social media campaign to educate Americans about the benefits of natural gas and natural gas pipelines. And so INGA really felt that with new pipeline projects and lots of varying viewpoints on the value of those projects, that it was important to highlight, the role that pipelines do play in our nation, in our everyday lives. And so safety is a key component of the campaign, but it's also about why we have pipelines and why we have hundreds and thousands of miles of them all over the United States. So this was launched in 2015 and leveraging several different social media channels, the website, the INGA website, of course, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. In full disclosure, this is one that I haven't been as involved in, but it is an initiative of the INGA Communications Committee, and a great campaign for them and something they've had a lot of success with. So 3 key areas or sort of topics of information that are communicated through the campaign. Safety, like I said, big focus on safety. 811 is one of the key messages. Economic benefits of pipelines as well, and how they do play a role in our economy in the United States. And then the environment and how pipeline operators have safety programs to protect the environment and emergency response protocols to respond safely and effectively if there is an incident. So another sample video that we'll play for you today, this one's just a little over a minute long, that highlights sort of the focus of the America's Energy Link campaign.
Across the country, millions of Americans are cooking their meals and warming their homes thanks to the thousands of miles of pipelines that deliver natural gas. Have you ever thought about how the natural gas you use every day reaches you? Natural gas pipelines are the answer. According to the Department of Transportation, pipelines are the safest mode of energy transportation today. Technological advancements made over the years mean the energy you use is delivered efficiently, reliably, and safely. When pipelines are installed underground, safety, security, and the environment are top priorities, and high-quality materials and construction ensure they are met. Once pipelines are in place, they undergo a major pressure test called a hydrostatic test to ensure they are fit to begin operation. Once in service, pipelines are monitored 24/7 and regularly inspected, sometimes using a highly sophisticated internal inspection device called a smart pig. More than 99.9% of all natural gas moved through pipelines safely, thanks to integrity management programs maintained by pipeline operators and overseen by a federal regulating agency. A big part of this success involves preventing excavation damage by working with each state's one-call service pipeline operators. The 811 Call Before You Dig campaign helps prevent third-party pipeline damages. Our goal every day is zero incidents. We know our consumers demand safety, and so do we. Together, we are America's Energy Link.
So results of the America's Energy Link campaign from September 2015 through May 2016. Major increase in Facebook likes, 426 to 5,100. Major increase in LinkedIn followers, Twitter, lots of uses of the hashtag on Twitter. So INGA is very pleased with how the response to this program. And again, social media is something that is top of mind for the organization and something they continue to use going forward. So again, back to the key themes that jumped out at INGA and again have been key, I think, in our conversation today. Innovation. So, you know, being cognizant of the new ways that are available to communicate and the new channels that people are really relying on to get their information nowadays. So leveraging social media, using video. I think anytime you can add a visual component or even an emotional component to a campaign, the more it's really going to resonate with your audience. Collaboration, so again, working closely with operators, with industry, with regulators, with stakeholders to improve public awareness. I think the idea of national campaigns is wonderful. I think that that's really how we're going to get through to people if we can pool resources and pool ideas and, again, being innovative and being strategic in the way that we communicate. And then messaging. So continuing to focus on safety, also getting at the importance of pipelines and natural gas. You know, one thing that you know, is critical if you're going to get through to people with the safety messages, you first have to help them see that pipelines are relevant to them in their daily lives. I think they're going to be a lot more open to a message if they understand how it relates to them and that there are pipelines in their backyard and in their community, and they're there for a very specific reason, and, you know, provide things that we all rely on every day in our daily lives. So going forward, a couple of things that you can expect to see from INGA. Continuing to increase reach of America's Energy Link and the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign. So looking at those innovative ways to communicate and leveraging them to get our messages out. And then we look forward to participating in the RP 1162 revisions that are being facilitated by API and providing input into that process. So with that, if you would like more information, I would encourage you to go to the INGA website, where you can find lots of different resources. As I mentioned earlier, the organization is very active on social media, so feel free to follow INGA on any of the channels you see listed below. And if you'd like some specific information, feel free to reach out to myself, or Kathy Landry is actually the staff member from INGA who supports the communications team and the public awareness teams from an INGA perspective. And those groups are, of course, made up of different operators from the various operating companies. But Kathy is a wealth of information and very helpful if you do have any specific questions on INGA or their plans for the future with public awareness. So with that, I thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'll turn it back over to Christy for questions.
Thank you, Kesley. We are at the end of our panel discussion, so I would like to open it up for any questions or comments. Any from the webcast viewers this time? Yes? Okay.
Who test?
So we did have a few questions from earlier in our earlier panels. And I think what I'll do here is maybe have the CATS managers answer a couple of these questions, if you're okay with that, Christy.
Well, in the interest of time, if they're from the previous panel,
yes,
we can respond to them offline, but
okay,
specifically while we have this panel here,
okay,
if we could focus on any they may have that are relevant.
Right. Well, we do have one question for this panel, and I'll go ahead and let you ask that question, Ian.
Okay, the question is, has anyone done any measurement to see if the people who work or live in hard-to-evaluate structures very near pipelines, i.e. schools, hospitals, nursing homes, high-rise apartments, etc., know they are near a pipeline and have plans of what to do in an emergency? Seems like a fairly easy way to measure public awareness, and a similar effort in Canada showed that nearly no one knew they lived near a pipeline or had a clue about any evacuation plans. Interested to know if PHMSA or industry has done a survey.
Any input from the panel?
I'll take a stab at this. Is this on? Can you hear me okay? I had mentioned in my presentation that API is a contract with a research company, and they do a survey every other year, and it's the 4 stakeholder audience identified in 1162, and that includes affected public. So those are people that live and work along a pipeline route, and so it would include apartment complexes, hospitals, schools, those sorts of locations would be included in that measurement. So I'm not aware that there's anything specific that we pull out specifically, say for schools as an industry, for schools or apartment complexes, something like that. But when we measure along the pipeline route and would include anyone along the route.
Thank you. Okay, are there any other questions from in the room for the panel?
Just 2 quick things. In reference to the RP 1162, I know I tried to study it and research it before I came today. I was able to print the SWOT report, which was great because I can make highlights and notes, along with the Enbridge pipeline public awareness. I was able to print that, super helpful. But for the 1162, I couldn't print it. So it was really hard for me to look through all of it. And I'm a physical person. I like to touch it. I like to feel it. I like to read through it and make notes. So maybe if that's something that can become a printable document, that would be very helpful for the public. And then one other thing, and I noticed this personally as well, in reference to 811 for calling for markers. It's a great tool, except once they come and mark the lines, no idea what to do from there. Just within the city of Marshall, there were markers for trees to be installed. And it was through a local organization that was planting trees, a revitalization of trees in town. The markers were there, yet they still planted trees right on top of 4 markers that were right in front of my house. And it was gas, liquid, I mean, you name it, it was all there. And they still planted a tree right on top of it. So I think we need to expand aside from marking them, give an indication of what you can, can't, should, shouldn't do above those markers.
Good point. I'll let Karen address the API RP 1162 printable comment.
So we make those available for viewing only. They are not able to be printed because we we do sell those standards and recommended practices. If you were to be on the task group, though, you would get a copy. So.
Just a quick and obvious question for Karen. So what is the extent of public involvement in the development and reassessment of 1162? Who are the people? How do you find them? What efforts are made by API to generate public
So I actually
involvement?
did have a, oh, I'm sorry. So I actually did have a slide that I really buzzed through on that will be part of it, but outreach efforts, website information, but of course you may not know to go to the website, webinars, events like this, different other conferences, you know, where we'll make mention of it by reaching out to different stakeholders that are even here, you know, asking them, do you know of anyone who might be interested in revising or being part of the reading group that will make comments before it even goes to ballot. So there are various methods that we'll use, social media postings, and soliciting recommendations from other members. So.
Just occurred to me one more question. So when you see the call 811 before you dig, I just wonder if some people might think, oh, I call them, they come, they do something, and they charge me money. So I wonder if it's possible that you should be indicating it's free.
That's a good point. Some of our outreach actually does go that far to explain, and some of the additional literature we provide. And I know we have some campaigns that we're going to be launching in August for 811 Day, where we're actually making sure that we include some of those key points about it being free. You mark, you wait for locate, and then you dig with care, those kind of messages to really help bring that theme back to call before you dig and what happens after that and what's the financial implication, for example. I had I'm sorry, was there another question? I had a question for Craig Potts related to your presentation where you really focused on behavioral change for excavators. And most of the information, I'm assuming most of it was really related to calling 811. I think you mentioned also some of the data was regarding the online tickets as well as a part of your presentation. But you got me to thinking, you know, we do a lot with call 811, but then some of the other presentations that we saw after that really talked about leveraging other electronic media like social media, et cetera. So how do we, and this is for anybody on the panel really, and in the room, how do we advance the conversation beyond just calling? Because there are some people who don't use the phone, and I'll be frank, some of the younger generations will text to death. I have to get my sons to really work to pick up the phone to call and have a live voice on the other end. They're much more comfortable with texting, you know, that more of an electronic form of communication. I see a hand in the back. So I'm curious in general, what's next with one call ticket request, whether it's in a call form, using the online form, apps, those kind of things. And I'm just opening it up.
I'll take a first stab here and anybody else can jump in. At the last CGA Education Committee meeting in June, we were told that the slogan that goes with 811 is changing, and so if I'm mistaken here, Gina, correct me, but I believe it's going to be know what's below 811 before you dig. So we're treating 811 as a verb, and part of your point about calling, a lot of the one call centers prefer online tickets because it's cheaper for them to manage those than it is to have somebody standing by to take a call. So that's a real preference, and they wanted to change to the slogan that goes with the logo. So I think that was a main driver for that. But your point about social media is, I think, right on, and Kesley kind of shared a little bit about social media. It's not even mentioned in RP 1162. And if you look at millennials, I mean, you know, we're generational change, if you will. I mean, my generation, everything's on paper. You read it. That's how it is. We've transitioned to electronic now. I've got 2 millennial kids. I mean, they're on their phones all the time. If you want to reach them, you better be on social media. I mean, so we have to think in terms of who our audience is and what's the best way to reach them. And specifically to the campaign that we're trying to do with Fleshman Hillard here, they know that they know how to reach them. They're very familiar with social media, and that's one of the components they would include in a campaign. But yeah, that's something we definitely need to consider.
Thank you. I call my millennials screenagers instead of teenagers because they spend most of their time looking down and scrolling than actually engaging with folks. Question or comment?
Well, with me being a part of the younger generation, I would say, I know with me coming on 4 weeks ago, I barely knew anything about pipelines or hazardous material, what to do or who I should call. So me being a part of PHMSA for these last 4 weeks has been a really great experience because I learned a lot. Like, I've been going home telling my parents, oh, call 811 like I'm a little kid coming from school. I mean, but that's where I would say like it starts. And I remember having a conversation with Miss Karen and Hung about reaching out to elementary schools and high schools and the area, middle schools also, because I know me coming up, that's something that was never taught, or I would have all these speakers come to my school, but that was something that pipelines was never one of the speakers. It was something about reading books, going to the library, was something of that nature. So I would say it starts with the younger generation and getting into their minds first. And then when it comes to social media, yeah, it's time to upgrade from the booklets. And I'm still learning too, but it takes some time, and with this, you just have to have patience with social media. But once you start promoting, putting out videos, images, it's just about getting the right crowd and doing the right amount of promotion. That's what I say.
Thank you.
Just a couple other points on social media, if I could. Thank you for your comments. I think it's great for a couple of other reasons. You can really geo-target. You can target based on keywords. You can really zero in on your audience. Also very cost-effective compared to more traditional types of media. And two-way dialogue. You know, we're talking about listening to stakeholders and, you know, providing more two-way communication. There's no better way to do that than social media when you can put something out and get direct feedback on a message and see who's actually looking at it, where they're from, how long they're spending on your page. So I think there's a lot of really great aspects of social media. You know, it's engaging, it's effective, and it's the way of the future. So I'm glad we're all talking about that today.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up in that vein as a Gen Xer, and hat tip to the millennials. But I did grow up with a computer, and I've kept up with some of this stuff. And so I do our Facebook page for the Association of Northwest Steelheaders, 1,500 members. And I can pull out a 4,000 hit piece, and we average 3,000 views a week. And I think you had 5,000 hits on yours, and I think your 30-second video's got 7,000. You're much more powerful than I am in terms of your potential reach, right? And then my boss will get on me, though. He'll say, like, yeah, but what's the conversion? What are you getting out of it? Show me a new member. Show money who's showing up. It's a really good point. My boss knows this. And so I'm not sure if actually what we're talking about here today and showing as demonstrations is really quite getting it yet, because just putting something on YouTube is good, and that video was super funny. Like the one the kids did, I was like, oh, this is gonna, not impress me. It impressed me. Like, I liked it. That was good. And yours was really glossy. Like, I mean, that's a great PR piece, right? But what converts, I think, is a real challenge. You're talking about, it reminded me of questions that nurses ask about outcome-based practices, right, and healthcare. I think that going to an outcome-based experience as opposed to like, well, we liked it, right? Or, we tested it in front of our friends and they all liked it. That's not really enough here for safety, right? So I have a challenge for everyone is to figure out how to put a conversion on the end of that, right? How to go for one more grab, how to follow up, right? Because you can track a lot of things, and that's very useful. But so I think we're not talking about brand identification or brand loyalty. I think we're getting out of PR. I think it's a mistake to hire a PR firm to do vocational education. I think you should be talking to a community college educator, right? I do. I think you should be talking to people who actually convey complex things. If you talk to company sportswear, who I've talked to, they say, absolutely, we want to get on Instagram, we want their first experience fishing, wearing our brand. All they're doing, all you have to remember is sportswear company's name. That's it. That's pretty simple. This isn't that simple. This is way more complicated. I think there is a limit to the technology. I think we're not asking enough of the technology follow-up. But I think in this world where we're talking about the outcomes, not just the do they like us, did we smile, is it an attaboy, do we get a funder to promote us because of this or whatever, I don't think that that's enough, right? So I encourage everyone who's hiring a PR firm to go talk to somebody at a community college about teaching kids complex stuff. Talk to a nurse who instructs people about putting on a bike helmet. They don't do it in a soundbite. They do it funny, right? They have great compelling messages, but there's way more grab to it, and they realize it's hard work. This is harder than brand loyalty. So I challenge you all to really talk to educators. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that your point is well received. Educators are certainly part of the community in which should be in the discussions, helping to share insights so that we can collectively develop better messaging. I think there is a place, going back to my elephant, somewhere on that elephant there's a place for a PR advertising firm who knows how to achieve bottom line results. And that may not be the catch-all, begin-all, end-all, but I think there's an opportunity for some collaboration and synergies. But to your point, bringing in folks who really know how to educate, get to the core of it based on what students and the people we're trying to inform really need to take away from it. So thank you very much for your comments. Yes.
Just to follow on what Craig mentioned with 811 before you dig, the old tagline is not going away. You'll have an option as an operator or as a one-call center to use what works for you. The one-call centers were the ones that wanted that because of web ticket entry, but a pipeline company may not be interested in using that and want to stick with the old version. So we've invested a lot of dollars in painting tank farms and doing all sorts of things, you know, Major League Baseball, you know, home plate signage. So the old is not going away. So I just wanted to clarify that. You'll have an option. With regard to the earlier comment, it's the law and it's free. We can't use that in all states, believe it or not, because there's exemptions. It's not the law for everyone, and it's not free for everyone. Believe it or not, in Pennsylvania, there's charges for excavators. You know, I know we're only tipping part of the surface today, and there's so much more to it that, you know, we're only not able to address all of it in just a short time. With regards to your school program, I know you're an intern and you're just learning, and we have so much to share with you. We do design the program so kids will go back and talk to their parents. And we actually, in one of the school programs, had kids take home cards, surveys for the parents, so we knew they had a conversation with the mom and dad and educated them in the process. And then they got a pizza party or some lure, but now schools won't let you serve pizza because it's evil and unhealthy. Go figure. You know, so we have all kinds of challenges thrown our way. But with regards to converting, we have at CGA developed curriculum with the University of Alabama and at a school program, or actually farm safety day camp, if you've ever heard of those. They're done with a progressive farm agricultural industry where they take kids on a farm and they teach them all kinds of things about farm safety, and one of them is pipelines, and we do it in a very fun manner, but we went to the educators to help with the curriculum because we don't always have all the answers, but we are open, we do listen, we're trying to help, and we're trying to grow and improve our programs. But all good points, and thank you for bringing those.
Okay.
Just real quick as well, I have children. Last year they were in 2nd and 4th grade. They came home from school one day, super excited, super thrilled, because they had a seminar about 811. So they came home with really cool flyers and pamphlets, and we sat down every night. We say, "What did you learn in school today?" Roll the eyes. But they were excited to tell us and share with us about the 811 dig. So then when we would drive around for weeks afterward, they would see the markers, and they recognized it, and they remembered it. So that's one positive thing, that my children are only 8 and 10. But they know it, they remember it, because it was something fun that they did in school, something that they did with their classmates. So we can find other ways to get them engaged that young.
Absolutely. I think we have a webcast question.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
This is the final question that's come in on the web today. It's, does PHMSA do any independent surveys to measure effectiveness of these industry programs that we've discussed today?
Currently, no. In the future, that's something that we need to explore, how that could work, how that could look, how we could segregate it out to understand more about the effectiveness. We could look at it geographically, maybe by industry, but at this time, we currently do not. But it's an opportunity moving forward to explore that more, and how we could fund it, and how we could take advantage of useful information from that. Thank you, webcaster, for the question. All right, so we are close to our closing time for our workshop. I found this workshop, and I hope that webcast viewers and those of you here in the room found it to be very insightful. I very much appreciate the dialogue and the comments and suggestions from the group here, specifically those who are representing the public and sharing your thoughts. A lot of thought-provoking, challenging, provocative comments came out of the discussion, which is necessary when we're talking about pipeline safety. So thank you for your comments. What I did want to do is just recap a few that I thought were noteworthy, but we will definitely make these available along with the recording. But some things that stuck out, the community emergency response team, using it as an opportunity to reach out. Let communities know who's representing, the public, and get the public more involved early in the process. Definitely making sure that that maybe we could try to look at developing a simple number to respond to gas leaks. Rural communities may not have all the financial support to really build up their capability when new pipelines are in their community. What can we do collectively? What can pipeline operators do to support their efforts? There's a need, there needs to be more public and public awareness, well received. And the list goes on, and I know everyone's anxious to get out of here. Rebecca talked about a buddy system. I thought that was a great idea, making sure that we collectively try to bring the public to us and support them to show up and have a presence. Invite tribal participation, provide messaging, brochures that's specific to some of their unique concerns. I thought this was interesting. Relinquish the assumptions many people do not care about pipeline safety or public awareness. I thought that was very interesting. Karen Simon talked about API and what to do to get involved with some of their efforts. One, she mentioned there's a task group that will be set up in the future, and I think John Buflet is available, and if you refer back to her presentation later, you can find out more information about how to get involved with that. And also, if you're not able to fully participate, there are, I think it's called there's reading groups that are set up so that when the draft of the next edition is available, you can still have an opportunity to review it and comment and share your thoughts. Changing behavior, it involves focusing on the emotional side of the brain in addition to the rational, and making a connection between the two. And the list goes on. But the key essence here is that there's a lot of great work that's taken place. There's a lot more that needs to be done. I don't know if you could ever complete your work with pipeline safety, as long as there's risks that we need to educate people of. But we certainly have heard a lot about opportunities and actions for change, actions for moving the needle with public awareness that we within PHMSA, and I know I can speak for Don and our state partners and regulators, we're going to keep our foot to the gas with trying to make improvements, drive compliance, and lead the way and help facilitate some of the improvements and opportunities we have. I'd like to thank all the speakers who graciously shared many of their perspectives, very thought-provoking perspectives. And I'd like to thank all of you here and the webcasters who participated. And I'd also like to give a special thank you to all of the PHMSA employees who helped pull this workshop off and coordinate a lot of the efforts. Another one I forgot to mention, but I thought was really important as we're talking about the public awareness workshop. I really heard the one comment made about not just having a public awareness workshop during a particular calendar year or planned time, but to take advantage of the captive audience you may have after some sort of a pipeline incident, unfortunately, and use that as an opportunity to educate and inform people. We will certainly take that back with many of the other comments and try to incorporate those into our future efforts. Enjoy your stay here in Chicago, and thank you very much for your participation.